나의 모든 걸 아프게 하잖아. 그 상처는 깊어져도 아파. 떠올면서 너를 찾지만 이미 너와 나 우린
The grand hall was suffused with opulence, the low hum of conversation blending with the soft clicking of crystal glasses. Chandeliers hung like frozen raindrops from the ceiling, casting shimmering light over the room. This event was a showcase of power, wealth, and alliances, a word I'd grown up in but never felt a part of. My father and I entered, his usual confident aura immediately commanding attention. People turned to greet him, their expressions a mix of respect and caution. This was his domain, not mine. As we approached the main table, I felt the weight of eyes following us. I was used to it. Being the daughter of a mafia leader came with its own. My father pulled out a chair for me at the center of the long table, nodding at me before moving to speak with his allies. I settled in, the silk of my dress brushing against my. That's when I saw him. Park JIMIN. The man I wasn't supposed to even look at, let alone speak to, was seated directly across from me. His sharp suit fit him like it was crafted just for him, the dark fabric contrasting with the soft waves of his jet black hair. He looked every bit the man I knew him to be, yet there was a softness in his eyes that only I knew existed. He smirked. The of his sent a jolt straight to my chest. I quickly looked down, my cheeks in betrayal of the composed image I tried to maintain. I hated the way my reacted to him, the way his presence made my stomach flutter and my heart race. This was bad. I sipped my drink, willing the blush to fade as I tried to distract myself by scanning the room. The tension in my shoulders eased slightly as I immersed myself in the mundane details of the party until a familiar presence disrupted my thoughts. A warm breath coasted over my neck, sending shivers down my spine. "You look stunning, darling," a low, velvet voice murmured. I froze. My hand tightened around the glass as I felt brush against the off neck, leaving soft. In their wake, my pulse quickened. Of the movement a stark contrast to the crowded room. "You don't look too bad yourself, Mr. Park," I whispered, turning my head slightly to meet his gaze. My voice was steady, but my heart wasn't. His eyes held a mischievous glint, his smirk deepening. "Careful, sweetheart. You'll give me too much credit." His hand brushed against mine under the table, a fleeting that spoke volumes. This was reckless and utterly. "JIMIN, we're in public," I hissed, glancing around to ensure no one had noticed the interaction. My father was still engrossed in conversation across the room, but the risk was too great. And he countered, leaning closer until were mere inches from my ear. Do you think I care? I glared at him, but the effect was ruined by the way my breath hitched as his fingers intertwined with mine beneath the tablecloth. You should care if my father sees. He won't, Jimin interrupted, his tone confident. And even if he does, do you think I'd let anyone keep me away from you? My heart swelled at his words, even as my mind screamed at me to be cautious. You're impossible, I muttered, trying to maintain my composure. And you're irresistible, he countered, his thumb gently stroking the back of my hand. Before I could respond, the sound of my father's laughter rang out, signaling his return. Jimin straightened, the playful expression on his face replaced by a mask of indifference. To anyone else, he was just another guest, but to me, he was the man who had stolen my heart in the most way. As my father approached, Jimin's eyes met mine one last time, a silent promise in their depths. This wasn't over. My father's heavy presence loomed as he sat back at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk, surveying its territory. I did my best to keep my face neutral, sipping my drink in a futile attempt to steady my nerves. Beside me, Jimin played his role to perfection, the picture of a composed and unbothered rival. So, Wyan, my father's deep voice cut through the din, making me jump slightly. What do you think of the event so far? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Elegant as always. My father gave a nod of approval, his attention already drifting toward the group of men seated across from him. But before he could fully engage in conversation, his gaze on Jimin, who was now leaning back in his chair with a casual arrogance that screamed defiance. Park, my father greeted coldly, his tone with thinly veiled disdain. Mr. Min, Jimin replied smoothly, his smirk returning. Always a pleasure. The tension between them was palpable. An invisible rope pulled. I clenched my hands in praying my father wouldn't notice how my eyes darted nervously between them. I trust you've been keeping to yourself, my father said, his words a challenge wrapped in civility. Jimin's smirk widened, his gaze flickering to me for the briefest moment before returning to my father. As much as circumstances allow, he said, his tone dripping with implication. I nearly on my drink. My father's eyes narrowed, his sharp intuition clearly picking up on something he couldn't yet place. "I'd advise you to tread carefully, Park," my father said, leaning forward slightly. "You wouldn't want to step out of line." "Of course not," Jimin replied, his voice silky smooth. "I always respect boundaries when they are warranted." The silent battle between them was unbearable, and I forced myself to intervene. "Father, didn't you mention earlier that you needed to speak with Mr. Kim about the upcoming shipment?" My father tore his gaze away from Jimin, his brow furrowing slightly. "You're right," he said after a moment, rising from his seat. "I'll be back shortly." As soon as he walked away, I exhaled the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Jimin's chuckle drew my attention, and I turned to glare at him. "What the was that?" I hissed, keeping my voice low. "That, darling," he said, leaning closer, "was me making sure your father knows he can't." "Me. You're," I whispered, my eyes darting around the room to ensure no one was watching us. "Do you have any idea how this is?" "I know exactly how it is," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you're worth the risk." My heart betrayed me, skipping a beat at his words. I hated how easily he could. Me. How effortlessly he could make me forget the chaos surrounding us. "Jimin," I began, but he me off. "Meet me on the balcony in 5 minutes," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Are you out of your mind?" "Always," he replied with a wink, rising from his chair. "But you love it." I watched helplessly as he strolled away, his confidence unshaken, despite the loaded stares aimed in his direction. 5 minutes felt like an eternity as I debated whether to follow him. Logic told me to stay put, but my heart had other plans.